I'm Jim Grismer, Professor and Dean Emeritus at the University of Denver. Welcome to Engaging Ideas, where we bring information and ideas from the Academy to the community to help think about real-world questions. Our topic today relates to North Korea and its nuclear ambitions. But rather than commenting on day-to-day events, we're going to look at this topic in a larger context: the history, interests, and relationships of the United States, China, Japan, South Korea, and of course North Korea. Our goal is to provide a deeper understanding of the issue and explore key elements of what might be a roadmap to resolving the crisis. No one is better able to do this than today's guest. Joining me is Ambassador Christopher Hill, who has been Dean of the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver for 7 years, and will soon assume a university-wide role as Chief Advisor to the Chancellor for Global Engagement, where he will help guide the overall university as it extends its global role. Prior to joining the university, Ambassador Hill was a career diplomat. A 4-time ambassador nominated by 3 different presidents, he served as ambassador to Iraq, Poland, and Macedonia. Most important for our discussion, he also served as ambassador to South Korea, was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, and in 2005 was named head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks aimed at resolving the North Korean nuclear crisis. I think you'll find he offers extraordinary insights on the Asia region, its relationship to North Korea's nuclear ambitions, and what that might mean in terms of finding a roadmap to resolving the nuclear crisis. So let's begin. Ambassador Chris Hill, welcome to Engaging Ideas.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure.
Our topic today, of course, is North Korea and its nuclear ambitions. In your book, your recent book, Outpost, A Diplomat at Work, you spend a number of chapters talking about this whole area of Northeast Asia, the interrelationships. So I'd like to kind of begin to focus on that, and maybe a good place to start is with a historical view. How long has North Korea been involved in this process?
Well, you know, for many people in the American public, they think this is a new problem, but it's a very old problem. It's probably, you have to go back to the 1960s when they got their first research reactor from the Soviet Union. But it wasn't really until the 1990s that they started making some real progress. And today, it's pretty clear they have something that looks like a nuclear warhead with some missiles clearly capable of delivering it. So we are at I think, a very important moment here. And again, it didn't start with Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George W. Bush, so it's been going on for quite a while.
What are North Korea's objectives in all this? If they've been doing it for so long, what are they trying to achieve?
Well, you know, opinions differ on that. You'll see people who say things like, well, you know, it's a small country, it doesn't have any natural friends, which has something to do with the behavior of the North Koreans. It doesn't have any friends, it has some predators, therefore it wants a couple of nuclear weapons to feel more secure. And that's a fairly benign interpretation of what has essentially been a 50-year project. So my view is that they have a much more purposeful and much more dangerous idea in mind, and that is to use nuclear weapons, to point them at the United States, and essentially cause questions in the minds of people in the United States and certainly in South Korea as to whether the U.S. is prepared to defend South Korea at the risk of exposing American civilians to a nuclear attack. So it's a very, very, I would say, purposeful program aimed at decoupling the U.S. from our ally there, that is South Korea.
Do you think that's had any success so far?
Well, certainly this issue of pointing weapons at us, I mean, we haven't had a new country get up on the net and and point a nuclear weapon at us for quite a while. So I think understandably the administration has put this really right at the top of the agenda of national security problems. But I think the real issue is whether, first of all, what we can do about this, and whether we can all understand that for us to blink, for us to suggest that no, we won't defend Seoul because we'll be concerned about North Korea's nuclear strike, I think that becomes a very dangerous moment, and we're kind of getting to that moment.
I know it's complicated, but there are a number of actors in here: the U.S., China, Japan, South Korea, and of course North Korea. Can you talk about the relationships? One of the things I think that is not well understood is how these pieces fit, if they do.
Yeah. Well, as your question suggests, there are a lot of actors here. I mean, it used to be in the 1990s, the U.S. tried to address North Korea alone, sort of one-on-one talks. And when George W. Bush came in and saw that the North Koreans had not been honest on a number of issues, he went to the Chinese president, then Jiang Zemin, and he said, look, we can't solve this by ourselves. The Chinese said, we can't solve this by ourselves, but perhaps together we can work on this and include other countries in the region. So in that meeting, which took place in Crawford, Texas, that was sort of the birth of these six-party talks. So now we have 5 countries very much engaged on the issue: the U.S., Japan, China, South Korea, and even Russia engaged on this issue, with the idea that somehow the 5 of us can put enough pressure on the North Koreans that they will understand that they have no future with these weapons, that they have to realize that none of these countries will treat them as a nuclear weapons state or will somehow acquiesce in them having nuclear weapons. So the hope is that this kind of multilateral pressure can eventually be effective.
Well, now, you were the head of the U.S. delegation in the six-party talks, I think in 2005 or so. Tell us a little bit about the dynamic that you experienced from that unique vantage point.
Right. Well, first of all, it was a new thing for the U.S. to be engaged in sort of multilateral diplomacy in Asia. And so when you think of the six-party talks, you might think that we were somehow all gathered around a table with 6 delegations talking to each other. In fact, that happened once in a while, but the real point of the six-party talks was to have a platform where you could have a lot of bilateral discussions, trilateral discussions, quadrilateral discussions. You had all kinds of means to talk to the North Koreans in a group or one-on-one. And often I would talk to the North Koreans, then I'd have a one-on-one with the Chinese, then I might have a 3-way discussion with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, or just a U.S.-Japan discussion. A lot of different ways to address it, all for the purpose of making the North Koreans understand that they've really got to give up these weapons if they want to have a future. And I used to say to them, you know, if you keep these weapons, you cannot have a future. So we will come after you, whatever it takes.
And eventually those talks kind of dissipated. What caused that?
Well, you know, I'm not sure the talks themselves dissipated. What happened was in the summer of 2008, we had reached an agreement with North Korea in 2005 where they agreed to abandon all their nuclear programs. But by 2008, we had been implementing it. We had shut down the reactor, for example. We had taken some measures to disable the reactor. We had given the North Koreans some fuel oil and things like that in return for further steps at denuclearization. But we found that by 2008, they started kind of slowing down on this process. Now, whether that was because Kim Jong-il became Kim Jong-very ill, that is, the leader of North Korea had a stroke at one point, we think in July or August 2008, but they clearly were not forthcoming. And at that point, we had to get a verification regime. That is, we had to get, you know, regardless of what the North Koreans had declared to us in terms of their nuclear arsenal, we needed to have the ability to go look at sites and say, yes, indeed, they have the numbers that they said they had. But the North Koreans wanted a situation where we'd look at sites only determined by the North Koreans ahead of time, and obviously it wasn't enough.
That sounds very different, that sort of thoughtful approach sounds very different than the sort of epithets that we see thrown back and forth very recently. Can you put those actions in perspective within the context of how do we actually move forward? What's the roadmap here?
That's the key. How are we going to move forward? And clearly, one thing we have discovered is we need China as a partner here, not as an adversary. And so that's difficult because there are a lot of Chinese who worry more about our military than they do about North Korea. So we need to convince them that we don't have a problem with China. Yes, we have our differences, but we don't have a fundamental problem with China. And that's difficult to kind of show them. I mean, there are a lot of Chinese who understand that their future is in the international trading system, should be a future in which they have a high level of cooperation with the U.S., but there are other Chinese who don't see it that way. They see the U.S. as threatening to them. So the first thing is we need to make sure that we can create a circumstance where we can actually talk to the Chinese and successfully do so. We also need to be able to support our allies, Japan and South Korea, make sure they understand that even if North Korea is going to point a nuclear weapon at them, they have our nuclear umbrella, meaning that if the North Koreans do anything with these countries, that is, attack them in any way, we will massively attack North Korea. So I think that's very important to reassure our allies. Another thing that is not so well understood, although it is understood certainly by Secretary Tillerson, we need to keep the door open to negotiations. Now, maybe we'd be lucky and the North Koreans will walk through it, but I'm not counting on that. But we need to keep the door open because the South Korean public that lives just a few miles away from North Korea, they want to see some sign that there's a diplomatic track. And so when American politicians say, well, there's no diplomatic track, there's no way we can convince these people, that's not what the South Koreans within a few miles of the DMZ want to hear. So we need to really be very careful of how we measure, how we say things, how we measure these overall, our statements and the impact they could have.
Let's talk a minute about Japan. Japan's an industrial powerhouse, easily within range of North Korean missiles. Traditionally a non-military since World War II. Yeah. What's the situation there? What role might they play going forward?
Well, Japan, I mean, if you look at a map, they're right there. And while Japan and South Korea do not have an alliance, we have an alliance with South Korea and we have an alliance with Japan. So if we have to flow in forces to South Korea, we need to involve Japan in that. So it's very important that we maintain a good relationship with the Japanese. I think we find that their public is very worried about the situation. Their government is very worried indeed, but the government tends to be a little more tough than their overall population. So we have to kind of vector in those two things and make sure that we have an understanding with Japan. And I must say the six-party talks, as difficult as it has been, as really unsuccessful in terms of the goal of denuclearizing North Korea as it's been, it has been helpful to bringing the U.S. and Japan closer together.
In terms, you mentioned this sort of denuclearization of the peninsula. Is that a reality that's achievable any longer?
Well, there's some people who say, well, they've already got a nuclear weapon pointed at us, therefore we can't compel them to give that up. My view is, first of all, they are heading in that direction, and sooner or later they'll get there. But I think we need to be very careful with the idea that we can live with a nuclear North Korea. I mean, after all, if we give in, if we acquiesce in that, what happens when they threaten some country, give us this or we'll nuke you? And they have a lot of these kinds of threats all over the world. So I think we need to kind of stay on this and understand the real seriousness of the problem.
You mentioned interesting point, and that is sort of the steps that the next steps. One of the goals of this series is to provide a basis for people to have discussions with their friends. Could you recap what you consider to be the really essential steps that need to be undertaken?
Yeah. I think we need to, engage ourselves with our allies. There should be no daylight between the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. and South Korea. We should be encouraging South Korea and Japan to work more closely together. We need to really have a deep dive with the Chinese. We need to make the Chinese understand what our interests are and what our interests are not. We're not interested in invading North Korea. We're not interested in inheriting North Korea. And we're not interested in a fight with the Chinese. And I think we need to do a much better job of encouraging the Chinese to work with us. Again, if we ever solve this problem, we look back and say, what were the ingredients of this success? It's not going to be that we kept a terrible relationship with China. I think more likely it's going to be that we developed a good relationship with China.
Well, Ambassador Chris Hill, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on the North Korean nuclear issue and a potential roadmap, key steps that we might wish to take. I hope you'll join us in the future as we bring more engaging ideas from the Academy to the community. I'm Jim Grismer. Thank you for watching.